She stood up right there in the middle of that restaurant, looked me up and down with the calm of someone who knows exactly what they're doing, then slowly turned her face toward the other women around us, and said loud enough for the entire dining room to hear, "Look at you, and then look at every other woman in this room." Pause. "Are you seriously not ashamed of yourself?" The restaurant went silent. Not the silence of people who didn't hear. The silence of people who heard and don't know what to do with it. The servers kept moving, but slower, like they'd stepped into that heavy field that surrounds certain public humiliations. The woman at the table next to us dropped her eyes to her lap. The couple by the window stopped eating. I felt my heart speed up in a way I didn't know was possible. That kind of heat that starts at the base of your neck and climbs slowly, burning every inch until it reaches the back of your eyes. But something different happened in that moment. Something I didn't expect from myself. I heard my own voice, calmer than I ever imagined it could be in a situation like that. And that voice said only, "Good night." I picked up my purse, walked a few steps toward the side entrance, and called the one number I needed right then. When Tamara picked up, I just said, "I need you to come, right now." Because what was about to happen, I couldn't face alone. But I also wasn't going to face it in silence anymore. If you've ever been humiliated in front of other people by someone in your own family, and that person called it concern, then you're going to understand every word of what I'm about to tell you. Subscribe to the channel right now, hit the bell, and tell me in the comments, has anyone in your family ever made your body their business and called it love? What was that like for you? Because my Aunt Patricia had been doing it for 20 years. And it took a Tuesday night at a restaurant in downtown Atlanta, a 30-second phone call to my best friend, and a series of revelations I never saw coming, to finally understand that love doesn't do what she did to me. Let me tell you how we got here. I was 34 years old when that night happened. 34 years of life built on top of a voice that wasn't mine, but that I'd learned to call my conscience. I was a high school English teacher at a public school in Kirkwood, on the east side of Atlanta. I had students I genuinely loved, a small house I'd managed to buy on my own 2 years before, through a lot of planning and a lot of spreadsheets, a stack of books on my nightstand that never got smaller because I bought them faster than I could read them, and a best friend named Tamara, a history teacher at the same school, who was the kind of person who answers her phone at 10:30 at night without asking why before asking where. I was fat. I am fat. Always have been. Not as a tragedy, not as a background detail I need to explain away. As a part of me. The same way I'm tall, the same way I'm black, the same way I'm the daughter of a woman who died too young and a father who did what he could with what he had. My body worked. I walked, I taught, I laughed, I ate with pleasure, I slept fine. My body was never my problem. The people around my body were my problem. My life before that night had a structure I took years to be able to see clearly. There was the school, the friends, the books, the house. There were the good days, the exhausting days, the weekends I spent in sweats reading on the back porch with a cup of coffee I always made too strong. And there were the Sunday dinners at Aunt Patricia's. Sunday dinners at Aunt Patricia's had been, for 20 years, the axis around which part of the family revolved. She was my mother's younger sister, 62 years old, hair dyed dark, always in an apron, always with an opinion fully formed before you walked through the door. She had the gift of appearing hospitable while exercising control. She'd put food on the table, ask about your life, and then, without any transition, say something about your body in the same tone she used to comment on the weather, like observing your weight was just a natural part of the conversation, like you were there to be evaluated alongside the potato salad. I grew up at that table, started sitting there when I was 11. I heard the menu of humiliation vary by season. In summer, it was the swimsuit I wasn't going to be able to wear like that. At Thanksgiving, it was the outfit she thought I should reconsider. At Christmas, it was the family photo where she'd suggest I stand in the back. At every birthday party for someone else in the family, it was the mention of how much better I'd looked a few years ago, as if my teenage self was a promise I'd broken. And there was always, without fail, a comparison. Sometimes with my cousin Destiny, 2 years younger, who Aunt Patricia felt had taken care of herself. Sometimes with a neighbor who had finally gotten it together. Sometimes with a version of me that existed in her imagination and was never real. A Nadine she described as so pretty when she was younger, as if the fact that I'd grown up was a betrayal. I remember the first Sunday dinner where I noticed the pattern. I was 15, sitting on the back steps drinking a Coke, wearing shorts and a t-shirt. She came up behind me, squeezed the side of my arm lightly and said, "You're putting on weight, baby. Tell your mama to get you into something." My mom was inside and didn't hear. I sat there looking at that can of Coke with the kind of shame that doesn't know where to land, that doesn't turn into anger or tears, just stays there, taking up space in your chest. I didn't say anything. I never said anything. And that was the part that, years later, I'd come to understand was the core of everything. The silence wasn't agreement. It was survival. It's what you learn to do when humiliation comes wrapped in affection and served alongside Sunday dinner. When the person doing it is the same one who lets you spend the afternoon at her house when you miss your mother who's already gone. You don't name it. You absorb it. And your body absorbs it with you. I walked into Dr. Gerald Simmons's office for the first time at 28, referred by a previous primary care doctor who'd retired. I went because of back pain that had been going on for months. I went confident. I left different. Dr. Simmons had a practice in Decatur, second floor of an older building with carpeted hallways and that particular smell of medical offices that I can still recall. A man in his mid-50s, grey at the temples, with a clinical manner I later learned to identify as laziness dressed up as efficiency. He looked at me, looked at the chart, weighed me, and then, without examining my spine, without ordering a single test, without asking me anything specific about the pain, said, "The most common cause of back pain in patients at your weight is the weight itself. Treatment starts with diet." I said I ate well. He said I might think I ate well. I said the pain was on my left side and got worse when I sat for long periods. He said that a sedentary lifestyle combined with excess weight worsened the lumbar muscles. I said I walked nearly every day. He wrote something in the chart, prescribed an anti-inflammatory, gave me the name of a nutritionist, and said, with a voice that made clear the matter was closed, "When the weight improves, the pain will improve. Come back in 3 months." The pain wasn't in my back. It was in my sacroiliac joint, a posture issue that a physical therapist diagnosed 6 months later in 10 minutes of assessment. But in that carpeted office, with a man who never once touched my spine, I left believing my body was my enemy, that if I were different, I'd be treated differently. I went back to Dr. Simmons 3 more times over the following years because he was the only primary care doctor in my insurance network near the school. Every time I came in with a complaint, fatigue, frequent headaches, disrupted sleep, the answer had the same core. Weight was the backdrop for everything. I left every appointment with a prescription and a feeling of having been found guilty of something I hadn't done. What he never asked was how I actually slept. Not the number of hours, but the quality. Never asked about stress. Never asked what was happening in my life. Never investigated anything beyond what the scale showed. And for 3 years, I kept going back, because it was what I knew how to do. The months leading up to that night at the restaurant had been heavy in a way I couldn't describe to anyone without sounding dramatic. The school was going through an administrative restructuring that had doubled the paperwork and cut actual classroom time. I'd taken on an extra class period. I was sleeping badly, waking up with my stomach already tight, going to work, coming home, reading a little, sleeping again, and the Sunday dinners kept happening. In that period, Aunt Patricia had entered a new phase. She'd started following wellness accounts on Facebook. She who barely knew how to use the app, and now showed up on Sundays with screenshots saved to share. "Nadine, look at this. This woman lost 60 pounds just changing what she ate. Nadine, did you know there's a surgery now that's not that invasive? Nadine, my coworker started this tea that's supposed to work miracles. I'll send you the link." And always, always that tone of urgency. As if my body were a crisis situation she was managing on my behalf because I was incapable of managing it myself. What I didn't know back then was that Aunt Patricia had a history, that what she was doing to me, she'd done to other women before me, that there was a trail, and that trail had a name, a voice, and evidence kept for decades in a shoebox inside a closet in a city 4 hours away. But I didn't know that yet. What I did know in that period was this. I woke up some days with the feeling of carrying something that wasn't mine. A kind of tiredness that wasn't about work. It was as if my own image had been built by other people, brick by brick, and I'd spent decades living inside it without realizing the blueprint wasn't mine. There were concrete things I avoided. I didn't go to parties where I didn't know anyone because the idea of being looked at by strangers activated something I couldn't control. I deleted photos before posting, not out of vanity, but because I spent more time looking at what I thought was wrong than at what was fine. When the school organized a beach trip at the end of the year, I offered to stay behind and handle the administrative paperwork. Tamara looked at me in a way I pretended not to understand. There were things I did that, if I'd stopped to examine them, had Aunt Patricia's fingerprints all over them. I avoided ordering dessert at restaurants when I was with people I didn't know well. I avoided brighter colors because they draw attention. I avoided talking about my own body in any situation, because every time I tried, Since I was a child, the conversation left my control and became advice I hadn't asked for. It wasn't happiness I felt. It was a kind of exhausted neutrality. A life that functioned but that I watched from a distance, like I was standing on the other side of a glass window. The night at the restaurant happened because of a coincidence. My cousin Marcus, older than me on my mother's side, was passing through Atlanta, coming from Charlotte, heading to New Orleans, stopped for 2 days. He organized a small dinner, 6 people, at a southern restaurant downtown that he'd been to before. He invited me, Aunt Patricia, my cousin Destiny, and 2 other relatives I rarely saw. I went because I liked Marcus. I went willingly, in a burgundy wrap dress I'd bought recently and actually liked, with my hair out. I went intending to have a good night. We spent an hour and a half talking about Marcus's drive down, about Destiny's new job, about a show someone had started watching. The food was good. I ordered shrimp and grits. I got a glass of sweet tea, then switched to wine. I was relaxed in a way I rarely managed in family situations. And then came dessert. I ordered the banana pudding, and it was that movement, that simple gesture of closing the menu and telling the server, "I'll have the banana pudding," that set off what came next. Aunt Patricia looked at me, said nothing for a moment. Then, with a voice that pretended to carry weight, she stood up. And I never understood why she stood up, but she did, like she was about to give a toast, and said, "Look at you." And then look at every other woman in this room. The dining room went quiet. I saw Destiny look down at her plate. I saw Marcus open his mouth and close it. I saw the couple at the table next to us stop moving. "Are you seriously not ashamed of yourself?" I counted to 3 inside myself. I didn't plan it. It just happened. I said, "Good night." I stood up, picked up my purse, gave Marcus a hug, because the dinner was for him, and I wasn't going to blow up someone else's dinner, and walked to the area near the side entrance. I called Tamara. She picked up on the second ring. "What happened?" she said. "I need you to come, right now." She didn't ask anything else. Told me where she was, calculated the time. 20 minutes. I waited outside the restaurant in the January cold of Atlanta at night, which is a different kind of cold than people who don't know Atlanta expect. Not the brutal Midwest cold, but something that settles into you in a specific way, through your coat, into your shoulders. I stood there looking at Peachtree Street, at the Friday night movement of people going in and out of bars and restaurants, at a couple walking a dog who had absolutely no interest in the cold. And I felt for the first time in a long time that something had broken inside me in a way that wasn't destruction. It was something else. It was the end of a patience I didn't know how to limit. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in me that I only managed to name much later. It was like that night at the restaurant had broken a membrane, not violently, but with the precision of someone who had finally reached their limit. I drove home that Tuesday, walked into my house, put the burgundy dress in the wash with that exaggerated care you give to things when you need to do something with your hands while your head processes, and went to sleep. But before I fell asleep, I did something I'd never done before. I opened a new notebook, one I'd bought to write lesson plans in and never used, and started writing. Not a list, not a plan, just what I remembered. The first time Aunt Patricia had commented on my body, the phrases I'd heard the most, the Sunday dinners I'd left early with a headache as an excuse, the wellness links she forwarded in the family group chat, the day she said the blouse I was wearing makes you look bigger. The day she looked at a photo from my 30th birthday and said I'd looked so much better a few years before. I wrote for an hour and a half, and when I stopped, I looked at those pages and realized I had documented without knowing it a pattern that had been going on for 2 decades. It wasn't venting, it was a record. There was no anger in that notebook. There was something colder and firmer. There was clarity. I called Dr. Simone Wells a few days later. She was a therapist with a practice in Inman Park, recommended by a science teacher at school who'd started therapy the year before and had that quality of someone who went through something and came out the other side more whole. I made an appointment for the following week and walked in with the notebook under my arm, not because I was going to show it, but because that was how I carried that thing, as evidence, as proof that what I was living was real. Dr. Wells was in her early 50s, natural haircut close, and had that kind of presence that doesn't need volume to fill a room. In the first session, she asked me a question that no healthcare professional had ever asked me before. How would you describe your relationship with your own body? Not medically, emotionally. I sat in silence for a moment that must have lasted too long. Distant, I finally said, like I'm watching it from outside. She wrote something down, didn't say anything, waited. I feel like my body is other people's opinion of me, I said. And when I said it out loud, it was the first time that idea had left the place where it was stored and become language. It's not mine, it's theirs. Dr. Wells looked at me with an expression that wasn't surprise or pity. It was recognition. That's one of the most effective forms of internalized fat phobia, she said. When outside voices stay long enough, they start sounding like our own. You didn't develop this relationship with your body by accident. Someone built it brick by brick. That phrase stayed with me for weeks. Someone built it brick by brick. It wasn't a character flaw. It wasn't weakness. It was architecture, a deliberate construction, even if the person who built it genuinely believed they were doing good. In the weeks that followed that session, I started doing small things that had the texture of reclaiming territory. I went to a restaurant with Tamara and ordered dessert without checking what she was getting first. I went to a party a new teacher was throwing and stayed 2 hours without positioning myself near a wall. I bought a printed wrap blouse, the kind that, according to Aunt Patricia's voice in my head, draws too much attention, and wore it to a faculty meeting on a Thursday in March. None of those things were revolutionary. They were bricks in my own construction, and it was on a Sunday in March, 8 weeks after the night at the restaurant, that my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. The voice was an older woman. She said, "Nadine? Nadine Coleman, Janet's daughter?" I said, "Yes. This is Claudette. I'm Patricia's older sister." I went quiet. Claudette was a name I'd heard only a few times in my life, always as a side reference, always as someone the family didn't mention much because she fell out with everybody. An older sister that Aunt Patricia rarely brought up, and when she did it was with a kind of coldness I'd learned not to question. "I know we don't really know each other," Claudette said. "I live in Memphis now. I'm 73. I've been away from this family for a long time." Pause. "But I heard about what happened at that restaurant." "Who told you?" "Destiny. She calls me sometimes, keeps me up on things." "Why are you calling me?" She took a deep breath. "Because what happened to you in that restaurant happened to me in 1987. Different words, same Patricia." I sat down, silence for a moment. Claudette said, "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone in the family?" I said yes, and she told me. In 1987, Claudette had been married for 4 years to a man named Bernard, who she loved genuinely. They lived in Memphis, had a young son, were building something together. Aunt Patricia, younger, came to visit for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks, with the steady cadence of a drip, Patricia started saying things to Bernard about Claudette's weight, small things, seemingly concerned things. "Don't you think Claudette's been letting herself go? She's been eating a lot this week, have you noticed? I'm telling you out of love. You're the one who has to live with her." I heard that and something in me recognized the script, word for word. "She did it over 2 weeks," Claudette said. "And Bernard wasn't a bad man. He was a man who started looking at me differently after those 2 weeks, who started asking questions he hadn't asked before, who carried her voice in his head for months. And the marriage lasted another 2 years, but it was never the same. She planted something that didn't have an antidote, because I didn't know what had been planted. I thought the problem was me. I let the silence last." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Destiny told me what happened, and because I have a shoebox full of letters I kept from that time. Letters I wrote to Patricia that I never sent. Letters she sent me asking for forgiveness in a way that wasn't forgiveness. It was asking for silence. And because I have," she paused, "a recording." I sat up straighter. "A recording?" "About 3 months ago, my granddaughter helped me get into a family group chat. I joined without telling anyone, and a week later, on a regular day, Patricia sent a voice message in there. She forwarded it to me. I listened alone, with my earbuds in, sitting on the floor of my living room with my back against the couch. Aunt Patricia's voice in the recording was talking to someone, probably a cousin I barely knew, about me. She laughed with that confiding laugh of hers and said, "Nadine is never going to change because she doesn't have the discipline. Same as her mother was, honestly. Janet never had it either. We'd say something, try to help, but she just didn't have it in her. It's that side of the family, her daddy's people. Such a shame." I listened twice, and then something happened that I didn't expect from myself. I didn't cry. I opened the new notebook, and I wrote, "Someone built it brick by brick." And right below that I wrote, "Now it's my turn to tear it down." I needed 2 weeks to fully understand what I had in my hands and what I wanted to do with it. I talked to Dr. Wells about the recording. She didn't tell me what to do. She asked the right questions. "What do you want to happen?" "I want the family to know." "Why?" I thought about it. "Because for years they stayed quiet at those Sunday dinners. And I need to know who stayed quiet because they didn't realize, and who stayed quiet because they did and chose not to say anything. And if some of them don't apologize, then I know who they are. That's information too." I talked to Claudette 2 more times over the following weeks. She sent me photos of some of the letters she'd kept. Not all of them. just the ones she felt were relevant, including one Patricia had written in '89 where she said explicitly, "I know I went too far with Bernard, but you needed someone to say something." It wasn't an apology. It was a justification. The pattern was documented, decades apart, the same moves. In the second week of April, the family was having a Sunday dinner to celebrate a cousin who'd just graduated from nursing school. Extended family at an aunt's house in Stone Mountain early afternoon. Aunt Patricia had confirmed. Destiny was going to be there. Marcus, who was back in town, was also coming. I confirmed I'd be there. I arrived at noon, in black slacks and the printed blouse, the same one from the faculty meeting. I said hello to everyone with the kind of calm you have when you've slept well and you've prepared well, and I found a seat that gave me a view of the whole living room. Aunt Patricia arrived 15 minutes later. She saw me, waved like nothing had happened, went to greet the others. The meal went on. Somebody's mac and cheese, somebody's deviled eggs, the cousin's mom's peach cobbler cooling on the counter. Conversations overlapped. The cousin talking about starting her nursing job, somebody's kid who'd made the honor roll, somebody's basement renovation that was taking forever. And then, in that after-dinner lull when people were still at the table with their plates pushed back, I stood up and said, "I need to say something to the family." Aunt Patricia looked at me. With that expression I knew, slightly impatient, slightly curious. "Nadine," she said like a warning. "Aunt Patricia." I turned to face her directly. "About 3 months ago you sent a voice message in a family group chat. You didn't know I was in the group. I want everyone here to hear that message." She opened her mouth, closed it. "You can't just—" "I can." I pulled out my phone. "And I'm going to." The living room got that silence I recognized from a restaurant downtown on a Tuesday night in January. But this time I was the one standing. I pressed play. Her voice filled the room. "Nadine is never going to change because she doesn't have the discipline. Same as her mother was. Honestly, Janet never had it either. We'd say something, try to help, but she just didn't have it in her. It's that side of the family, her daddy's people. Such a shame." The silence after the recording lasted as long as it took everyone to process what they'd heard. Aunt Patricia had gone pale. She started, "That's out of context." "What context?" I said. "Calm, very calm. You were talking about me and about my mother. About Janet, who died 11 years ago and can't speak for herself. What context removes that?" I was venting. "To who? Who are you venting to about my dead mother's lack of discipline?" She opened her mouth again. Nothing came out. I turned to the room. "I also have some letters that Claudette sent me." Claudette is Patricia's older sister. Some of you might not remember her well because she separated from this family back in the late '80s. She separated because Patricia spent 2 weeks at her house and left behind something that took 2 more years to finish off her marriage. Pause. Claudette kept everything. I saw Destiny cover her mouth. I saw Marcus cross his arms slowly, with the look of someone piecing together something that was always there but never had a name. Aunt Patricia said, now in a voice that had lost its center, "You're being dramatic. You always make things bigger than they are." "Aunt Patricia," I sat down, because I didn't need to be standing to say what came next. "You spent 20 years making my body the subject of Sunday dinner. You used my body to make a comment in a restaurant in front of 6 people. You talked about my lack of discipline in a group chat with family members I barely know. And you talked about my dead mother to compare her to the daughter who didn't turn out the way you imagined." Pause. "I didn't come here for an apology. I came here so the family would know, because for 20 years, everyone stayed quiet at those Sunday dinners. And I need to know who's staying quiet now." What happened in the hours and days that followed was what Dr. Wells had prepared me might happen. The family didn't react as one unit. It never does. Destiny came to find me before I left. She stood in the hallway of the house, arms crossed, and said, "I knew something was wrong for a long time. I just didn't know how to name it." She didn't apologize directly for her own silence, but there was something in how she said it that I recognized as the beginning of a conversation that lasted months afterward. Marcus sent me a text that night. Simple. "You did what the rest of us should have done a long time ago. I'm proud of you." 2 relatives I barely knew didn't reach out again. I understood that as an answer too. Aunt Patricia didn't say anything to me that day. She left the gathering before it ended, without saying goodbye to me. In the months that followed, she sent me a message, not in the group chat directly, saying I had embarrassed the family, and that she never meant to hurt me. It wasn't an apology. It was the same pattern it had always been. Rewrite what happened until it looked like my fault. I read the message. Didn't respond. Not because I had nothing to say, because I'd learned that some conversations don't have a real purpose. They're just another attempt to put me back in the place someone built for me. And I had left that place. With Dr. Wells, in the months that followed, I came to understand things that don't fit in one paragraph, but that I want to try to summarize here, because they might be exactly what you need to hear. Family fat phobia is often the hardest to identify because it comes wrapped in the same package as love. The person who comments on your weight at Sunday dinner is the same person who showed up for you when things were hard. And that mixture confuses you, makes you minimize, makes you think the problem is your sensitivity, not their behavior. But there's an important distinction. Concern for your health sounds like this. How have you been feeling? Are you sleeping okay? Is there anything I can do? Fat phobia disguised as care sounds like this. Comments on what you eat, comparisons to other people, observations about your body in public, unsolicited suggestions about diets or surgeries. The difference is in who's at the center of the conversation. If the center is your well-being, it's care. If the center is your body's appearance, it's control. Internalized fat phobia, when outside voices become your inside voice, is one of the most effective ways of keeping ourselves small. When you hear for long enough that you have a problem, you start seeing yourself through that problem. You start avoiding the bathing suit, the party, the dessert, the photo. And every time you avoid it, the voice gets louder. Not because it's right, but because you never got the chance to discover it was wrong. You have the right to find a new doctor when you don't feel respected. That sounds obvious, and it isn't. For years, I went back to an office where I left feeling guilty for having a body because I thought it was what was available to me. It wasn't. There are providers who investigate before they judge, who ask before they prescribe, who treat the whole person, and not just the number on the scale. You have the right to keep looking until you find one, and you have the right to set limits with your family, not to cut everyone off. A limit isn't abandonment. A limit is, I'm not going to participate in conversations about my body. If that topic comes up, I'm going to change the subject or I'm going to leave, and then doing it. Every time, consistently. Because a limit without follow-through is just a suggestion. A limit with follow-through is real. The hardest part wasn't the April gathering. It wasn't hearing the recording. It wasn't organizing Claudette's letters. The hardest part was understanding that I wasn't wrong for having taken so long, that decades of silence weren't weakness. They were the possible response of a person doing what she could with what she had. And the moment I stopped staying silent didn't need to have come sooner. It came when it came. And it came. There's one more thing I want to tell you because it captures something that goes beyond my own story. 3 months before the night at the restaurant, Dr. Gerald Simmons had an appointment with me that lasted exactly 16 minutes. I'd come in with a complaint of persistent exhaustion, not the tiredness of someone who worked hard, but that fatigue that exists underneath everything, regardless of how much you've slept. It was a heaviness I'd been carrying since the beginning of the year that wasn't improving on weekends. That was starting to affect my ability to focus in the classroom. He weighed me, reviewed the chart, said I'd gained a couple pounds since my last visit. I said I knew, and that the issue was the exhaustion. He told me that fatigue in overweight patients was frequently associated with sleep apnea and low physical activity. Asked if I exercised. I said I walked 4 times a week, about 40 minutes each time. He noted it, prescribed a vitamin supplement and told me to come back in 2 months. I asked if there weren't any labs that could investigate the cause of the exhaustion. He looked at me with the expression I'd learned to recognize, professionally patient, mildly tested, and said, routine blood work isn't going to show anything that lifestyle doesn't already explain. The most effective path is behavioral change. I left without the labs. 6 months later, when I finally saw a new doctor, Dr. Alicia Okafor, a primary care physician in Decatur who came recommended by a colleague at school, she ordered a full blood panel at our first visit. And one of the things that showed up was an iron deficiency that was low enough to account for a significant portion of the exhaustion I'd been describing. It wasn't catastrophic. It wasn't a serious condition. It was a simple clinical finding that shows up in basic blood work, that any competent physician would have ordered in the first appointment where I mentioned persistent fatigue. Simmons never ordered it. Not because he was incompetent across the board, but because the filter he used to treat me was my weight. And when weight is the filter for everything, any complaint that can't be resolved by losing weight becomes invisible. That is medical fat bias. It's when a healthcare provider uses weight as the default diagnosis for everything, ignoring the clinical investigation that any other patient would receive. It's when you leave an appointment feeling like your body doesn't deserve the same care as other bodies. And the issue isn't just the physical harm, which is real. It's the harm that comes from believing, for years, that what you're feeling is your own fault, that if you were different, you'd be treated differently. That damage is harder to measure and harder to heal. You have the right to demand clinical investigation before any judgment. You have the right to ask, what tests are you ordering and why, at every appointment? You have the right to request a second opinion whenever you feel a complaint has been dismissed without investigation. You have the right to change providers without explaining yourself to anyone. And if a provider makes you feel that your weight is the obstacle between you and good care, find another one. Not because you owe your body a specific number on the scale, because you owe yourself a provider who treats you like a complete human being. Today when I wake up in my house in Kirkwood, the first thing I do is make coffee. Strong coffee, in a ceramic mug a friend made for me at a pottery class she'd been taking. I drink that coffee standing at my kitchen window, which looks out at the oak tree in my backyard that's enormous and old and turns colors in October in a way that still surprises me every year. It's not a life transformed from the ground up. It's the same life, same school, same students, same impossible-to-shrink pile of books. But something fundamental changed in how I inhabit it. I went to a family cookout in August. Not Aunt Patricia's Sunday dinners, a different branch of the family, and served myself twice without checking if anyone was watching. I went to a colleague's birthday party and stayed until midnight, on the dance floor, without once asking myself whether I was taking up too much space. I bought a swimsuit for a trip I'm planning to the coast this summer. I didn't fold it away at the bottom of a drawer. I hung it on the back of my closet door to remind myself the trip is actually happening. Claudette calls me once a month now. She's funny, direct, has a mind like a trap, and a frankness at 73 that I hope to grow into. She told me on our last call, I should have said something sooner, but sometimes you can only speak up once someone else opens the door. Destiny and I grabbed lunch last month. It was the first time in my life we talked without the backdrop of Aunt Patricia, without Sunday dinner, without the family dynamic around us. It was easier than I expected. She's actually hilarious. I didn't know. Aunt Patricia hasn't been to any family event since April. I heard through others that she feels she was treated unfairly. I don't follow it closely, not because I've forgotten, because it stopped being relevant. There's a difference between those two things that I only understood once I experienced it. Dr. Simmons still has his practice indicator. I never went back. Dr. Okafor, at our last appointment, asked me how I was sleeping. Not how many hours, but how it actually felt. Then she asked what was going on at work. Then she asked about stress. She spent 23 minutes with me before she even looked at any numbers. I walked out of that office feeling something I couldn't name immediately. Later, driving home on I-285, I understood what it was. It was dignity, the feeling of having been treated like a whole human being inside a doctor's office. It seemed like a small thing. It wasn't. The woman who walked quickly out of that restaurant downtown on a January night and stood on the sidewalk waiting for Tamara with Atlanta cold on her shoulders and her heart going faster than it should, that woman still lives in me. She didn't disappear, but she's not the only voice anymore. Standing next to her is someone who understood something essential. The problem was never the body. The problem was what I was taught to see when I looked at it. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that she's not alone. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where you chose who deserved to stay in your life, even if it was family? The moment when something inside you said enough. Maybe it was quiet. Maybe it was loud. Maybe it happened alone in your living room on a Tuesday night. Tell me right here. Thank you for staying until the end. The fact that you're still here, at the end of something this long and this heavy, means something. It's the kind of attention we give to things that matter. And you matter, far more than any number on any scale could ever tell you. There's a scene from that period that I need to go back to, because it captures something I think is worth sitting with a little longer. About a month after the recording came through, so roughly 2 months before the April gathering, I was in Dr. Wells's office and she asked me something I hadn't expected. What do you think your aunt believes she was doing all these years? I didn't answer right away, because I'd spent a lot of time up to that point thinking about what Aunt Patricia had done, not as much time thinking about what she believed she was doing. I think she believed she was helping, I finally said. And does that matter to you? Her intention? I thought about it for a long time. It matters in the sense that I don't think she's evil. I think she's someone who learned, somewhere along the way, that commenting on women's bodies was a form of love, that if you cared about someone, you said something. That silence was indifference. And what did that belief do to you? It made it impossible to name what was happening, I said, because every time I started to feel like something was wrong, I'd remind myself that she meant well, and meaning well became this kind of blanket that smothered everything else. That conversation changed how I thought about the whole thing, not in a way that made it okay. Nothing about it was okay, but in a way that helped me understand why it had been so hard to see clearly for so long. Harmful behavior dressed in good intention is some of the hardest behavior to name, because the moment you name it, you feel like you're accusing someone of something they didn't mean to do. But here's what I learned. Intent and impact are not the same thing. Aunt Patricia could genuinely believe she was acting out of love and still have spent 20 years doing damage. Both things can be true at the same time, and the damage doesn't require malice to be real. I also want to talk about something that I think gets missed in a lot of these conversations about family and body image, and that's the particular cruelty of public humiliation. What happened in that restaurant wasn't the worst thing Aunt Patricia had ever said to me in terms of content. There had been more pointed moments, more specific digs, more sustained conversations over the years that had done deeper damage in private. But the restaurant was different because of the audience, because she chose to perform it. That's a specific kind of cruelty. The decision to use a public moment as a stage, to enlist the discomfort of strangers as pressure, to make the humiliation a spectacle. And I think a lot of women who have experienced this kind of thing from family members will recognize what I'm describing, that particular flavor of it, where someone who loves you in private uses a crowd to make a point. What I said in response, "Good night," wasn't calculated. It was instinct. But looking back, I understand why those two words in that moment were the only possible response. Because anything more, a defense, an explanation, an argument, even tears, would have been playing the game on her terms. Good night was the only way to leave the game entirely. The phone call to Tamara was the rest of that instinct. I didn't want to drive home alone. I didn't want to sit with it in silence and let it calcify into something I'd absorbed the same way I'd absorbed every Sunday dinner for 2 decades. Something in me understood, even in the moment, that this time needed to be different. That this time, I needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear it for what it was. Tamara arrived 20 minutes after I called. We sat in her car outside the restaurant for a while, and then drove to a diner nearby and got coffee, and I talked for 2 hours, not crying, which surprised me, just talking. In that flat, clear way you talk when something has finally broken through a surface you didn't realize was there. She said very little. That was the right thing. At the end, she said, "I've been watching this for years. I'm glad you called. I want to say something about that, about the people who watch and don't know what to do." Tamara had been my friend for 6 years at that point. She'd seen me at Sunday dinners, heard me talk about Aunt Patricia, watched me absorb those comments and redirect the conversation and leave early with headaches. She'd had moments where she'd wanted to say something to me. She told me this later, but she hadn't known how to name it without overstepping. She hadn't wanted to make me feel worse. I don't tell you this to excuse the silence of bystanders. I tell you because I think it's real and common. The people who care about us sometimes don't know how to speak into what they're watching, especially when the person being harmed is minimizing it themselves. When you're the one saying, "She means well," you make it harder for the people around you to say, "I'm not sure she does." That's another thing that heals when you start naming it. Not just your own relationship to what happened, but the space it creates for the people around you to say what they've been holding. The Sunday dinners at Aunt Patricia's had been a tradition in our family since before I was born. They predated me. They'd been the backdrop of my mother's childhood too. Janet, who by all accounts had the same experience with Patricia that I did, who left those dinners looking smaller than she arrived, who never seemed able to say the right thing in Patricia's presence. I'd grown up watching my mother navigate it and not understanding fully what I was watching, because as a child you assume the dynamic is natural. You assume that's just how family is. My mother died when I was 24. Ovarian cancer, fast and relentless, gone inside 14 months of diagnosis. There are things I'll never be able to ask her, but one of the questions I've sat with, in the years since the April gathering, is whether she knew, whether she saw in our family dynamic what I've now learned to see, whether she felt, at her own version of those Sunday dinners, what I felt at mine. Claudette thinks she did. Janet felt it, she told me on one of our calls. She just didn't have the language for it that you have now. None of us did back then. We called it family. We called it love. We didn't have a word for what it actually was. I've thought a lot about that, about the language, about how much it matters to have words for something. Because until you can name it, you can't fully see it. And until you can see it, you can't protect yourself from it. Gordophobia, fat bias, weight stigma, body shaming. These aren't fancy academic terms. They're labels that attach to real experiences, real moments, real damage done inside real relationships. Having a word for what happened to me didn't undo any of it, but it gave me a handle. It made it possible to hold the thing at arm's length and look at it clearly instead of just absorbing it as the weather of my life. The last thing I want to say, before I send you on your way, is about the version of me I found on the other side of all this. Not the version with a different body, the same body, but a different relationship to it. I don't think about my body the way I used to. I notice that sometimes the way you notice the absence of a sound that was always in the background. I used to run a kind of constant low-level commentary while I was out in the world, a voice that tracked and assessed and anticipated other people's assessment of me. That voice is much quieter now, not gone, but quieter. What replaced it partially is something harder to describe, something like presence. Being in my body instead of observing it from outside. Tasting food without also monitoring whether I should be eating it. Walking through a room without calculating how I'm being perceived. It sounds small. It is not small at all. For a lot of us who grew up with voices like my aunt's running as constant background noise, the absence of that noise is one of the most disorienting and freeing things that can happen. You don't have to go through what I went through to get there. You don't have to have the April gathering moment, the recording, the Claudette call, but you do have to start somewhere. And often, starting somewhere means finding the language, naming what's happening, saying out loud to someone you trust, "This has been hurting me." That's the door. If this story gave you anything at all, share it with someone who needs it. And tell me in the comments, you stayed all the way to the end of this. What brought you here? What are you still carrying? I want to know.